At the same time, hundreds of thousands of troops were still shipping out to Europe. By this point, the government knew how dangerous the flu was, so they had tried to contain the virus on ships. Visibly sick men were not allowed on the ships, but this didn't make much difference in the end. The flu virus incubates for a few days before any signs of infection are visible. On board the ships, the men were locked into their bunk rooms for most of the voyage across the sea, and armed military police enforced the segregation. On most ships, about 400 men were locked into each crowded bunk room in cramped quarters with little ventilation. Although the troops were segregated from others in the ship, they still shared the same mess hall where they all ate. They would file through, breathing the same air and touching the same tables and chairs as the group before. On one ship, called the Leviathan, the flu broke out almost immediately, despite the quarantine efforts. Within 2 days, it had overwhelmed the ship's medical services. The doctors and nurses were laid up sick alongside their patients, delirious, coughing, and blood pouring from their bodies. The blood pooled on the floor, and the nurses, who were still well enough to work, walked through the puddles, leaving bloody footprints on the deck. Finally, there were so many sick men that they began laying them on the deck of the ship out in the elements. They even lay there in storms, because the well were too overwhelmed to move them, and the ill were too sick to move themselves. At first, the deaths came spaced apart, and the officers took careful notes in the captain's log of the Leviathan. At first, they wrote the date and time of death, the name and rank of the deceased, their unit and cause of death. But only 1 week after leaving New York, the officers were so overwhelmed they wrote only name and time of death. The captain's log shows 2 deaths at 2 a.m., 1 at 2:02 a.m., 2 at 2:15 a.m. It continued like that around the clock. The healthy must have been terrified, locked onto a ship filled with a deadly plague with nowhere to escape. They began burying men at sea. At first they were solemn ceremonies, but after so many, the funerals became routine. They would read a name, say a brief prayer, and slide the body off the boat, then on to the next. The same was happening in every boat carrying troops across the ocean. Medical advisors begged the military to stop the troop movements, but the war machine needed men. At the same time, it was infecting the civilian population from port to port and along the railway lines. However, the very worst outbreak probably occurred in Philadelphia, and it was made immeasurably worse by mismanagement by leaders who ignored warnings from public health doctors. Had public health measures been implemented, perhaps much of the death and suffering could have been avoided. Philadelphia in 1918 was teeming with people. Hundreds of thousands had swarmed the city because of the new job opportunities working at steel plants, docks, railroad yards, and industries that supplied the war. Without enough housing for the influx, poor people were crowded into squalid, filthy slums that lacked indoor plumbing. Multiple families would cram into one apartment and share an outhouse in an alleyway with hundreds of people. Sometimes people shared not only apartments but beds, even sleeping in shifts. The boarding houses would rent out beds for 6 or 8 hours at a time. When one worker woke up to go to work, another worker would get into the newly vacated bed and sleep, same sheets and all. The streets were notoriously filthy, with rat infestations and gutters filled with trash, animal and even human feces. With people living in overcrowded conditions, exhausted from hard labor and weak from poor nutrition, dirty water and bad air quality, it was a perfect breeding ground for an epidemic. I had a little bird. Its name was Enza. I opened the window and influenza. Children's jump roping song, 1918. A ship full of 6 sailors arrived into the Philadelphia Navy Yard in mid-September. Within a few days, the Navy hospital was overrun, and the Navy began sending sailors to civilian hospitals in the city. As sailors began dying, the flu spread to civilians. 2 days after the first sailor arrived at the hospital, multiple doctors and nurses felt fine as they started their shifts, yet collapsed and became desperately ill within hours. However, the health board for the city didn't want people to panic. They downplayed the severity of the disease. After the death of several sailors and civilians, the health board confidently declared the disease had reached its zenith and already begun to decline. It hadn't even gotten started. At the same time, the federal government was desperate for money from war bonds to fund the war. People would buy bonds, essentially loaning the government money for a promise of being paid back later with interest. Every city had a quota of bonds they had to sell, and Philadelphia was ready to hold the Liberty Loan Parade to sell war bonds. Public health doctors begged the city to cancel the parade, terrified that it would cause the outbreak to become an epidemic. The city government ignored them. On September 28th, hundreds of thousands of people jammed into the downtown streets to watch the parade. In that huddled crowd, all crushed together, it only took a few coughing, sneezing people to launch the epidemic. Within 76 hours, just 3 days later, the city's 31 hospitals had run out of bed space. They were completely full. Some hospitals tried to cram in more by laying patients on cots in the hallways, in offices, and on balconies. In some cases, the sick were laid on the floor next to a dying patient. Once the patient died, the body was taken away, and the new patient would be lifted into the same bed, still warm from the previous occupant. The city opened several temporary emergency hospitals, but it wasn't enough. Hospitals started refusing to accept any more patients. People lined up outside begging to be let in. Some died standing in line. Even for those who got in, care was non-existent for most people. The hospitals ran out of medicine. The doctors and nurses were overtaxed, and they were dropping from the flu. They were desperate for help. People with no medical training volunteered. Physicians and nurses came out of retirement. Medical schools closed, and first-year medical students were put in charge of an entire floor of a hospital. One medical student reported that during the height of the outbreak, 1/4 of all the patients in the hospital died every day. Nurses were so overtaxed, they began adding toe tags to the living so they could tag several at once. Once a patient turned blue, it was only a matter of hours to death, so they felt confident in tagging them. Sometimes there wasn't any time for any intervention. Some people died within 24 hours of contracting the flu. A nurse at Mount Sinai Hospital started her shift in the morning and suddenly fell ill. She died 12 hours after first feeling sick. The number of dead kept growing. 5 days after the city held the Liberty Loan Parade, city leaders finally acted. The health department banned all public meetings. Churches, schools, and theaters were closed. They left the bars open, but those too were closed the next day. The courts closed and city services shut down. It took only a few days for the city's operations to completely grind to a halt. Within just 10 days, Philadelphia went from a few hundred cases of flu and a couple deaths per day to hundreds of thousands of people sick and hundreds dying every day, all because they ignored public health guidelines. By 3 weeks after the parade, the death toll stood at 4,500. So many died that they couldn't be buried fast enough. Gravediggers were sick or refused to bury flu victims. The bodies started piling up inside morgues and funeral homes. Some undertakers raised their prices 500% to try and cash in. Most ran out of coffins. One funeral home that hadn't run out hired guards because people were trying to steal the coffins. People began wrapping their dead in blankets or sewing together flour sacks to use as shrouds. No one came to take the bodies, and there was nowhere to bring them, so the dead stayed in the homes. People wrapped them in blankets and set them in closed-off rooms. The bodies were laid on porches or stacked in back alleys. In the poor, overcrowded tenement houses where multiple families lived in one apartment, there were no porches or spare rooms to put the bodies. They set them in the corners or stacked them in the alleyways next to the shared outhouses and drinking water pumps. Sometimes people were so sick that the person in bed next to them would die, and they couldn't gather the strength to take the body away. The city began to smell, the stench of death hanging heavily in the air. Finally, families began digging their own graves to bury their dead. Everyone was terrified. People avoided each other. There were cases of children whose parents got sick, and the children starved because no one would go near them in case the child was sick. This was particularly a problem since those who were most likely to die were people aged between 20 to 40, many of them parents. People couldn't get food because no trucks were delivering goods in the city. The streets fell silent. Every business was closed. People hid inside their homes. The streetcars stopped. The police cars stopped. The entire city ceased to function. You were constantly afraid. You were afraid because you saw so much death around you. You were surrounded by death. When each day dawned, you didn't know whether you would be there when the sun set that day. It wiped out entire families from the time that the day began in the morning to bedtime at night. There wasn't any single soul left. William Sardo, Washington, D.C.